I never thought that a simple time of death could become an unsolvable mystery. In Rosario, working on the case of a person found dead, the report stated that he had died around 10 p.m., but every damn biological detail screamed that something was wrong. The body temperature, rigor mortis, even the chemical reactions in the tissues, nothing matched that time. It was as if time had broken for that body. How could it be? When had he really died? Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. So there I was, Dr. Felipe Navarro, 45 years old, forensic doctor use of precise dates and times, facing a case that shattered everything I knew. The scene was simple, an apartment in downtown Rosario. Nothing out of the ordinary, and yet death seemed to mock my clocks and calculations. The victim, a man about 40 years old, alone, with no criminal history. Nothing to explain a mystery like this. But the signs were contradictory. The preliminary report made by a team just at the scene marked an exact time, based on what was called standard biological signs. That's when everything started to get complicated. The first thing I do in these cases is check the body temperature, something basic. A cold body indicates the deceased has been dead for hours. In this case, the temperature upon arrival at the morgue did not match the indicated time. So I checked the rigor mortis, another crucial clue, if the body was stiff or loose. It gave me a time window to know when the inevitable had happened. But that didn't fit either. The rigor was strange, somewhat advanced for a supposedly recent death. What was going on? I had to think beyond the usual protocol. Then I studied the chemical reactions inside the body, those that tell us how long the organism had stopped functioning. The pH, the decomposition of certain tissues, even that colder scientific fact was giving data that didn't coincide with the initial report. My head spun with charts and formulas, running calculations hoping to find an error, either mine or the team's at the scene. But it produced nothing. It was as if the clock had stopped for that body, but life around it was moving in a different time. Perhaps the most frustrating thing was that there were no signs of tampering with the body, nor any indication that someone wanted to hide the real time of death. Nothing. What I knew was that science should be able to explain anything, but this time it couldn't. On one of those long nights, accompanied only by my notes and cup of coffee, I reviewed everything again and again, and there, in what seemed like an insignificant detail, I began to see that the human context was a key. The man had lived alone, but the day before he had been in contact with several people, even a casual meeting at a bar in the afternoon. The curious thing was that the accounts from his friends and neighbors said things that didn't match the official time. His last living appearance had been later than the report indicated, and that changed the entire meaning of the case. Because biological data, although it seems exact, can be influenced by factors that science often does not take into account. Environmental conditions, undetected illnesses, even the emotional state of the deceased. And that's when I understood that death is not measured only by clocks or formulas. The time of death has a human component that sometimes goes unnoticed. The truth, when I looked closely, wasn't in the numbers, but in those living intangible circumstances surrounding the man. That day I realized that any forensic doctor must know that science is a tool, but not always the answer. This case taught me that in forensic medicine, sometimes a mystery is not just a riddle to solve, but a reality we must accept sometimes slips away. And that time that didn't match finally taught me that no death is as simple as it seems, and that the hours will always mark what life, in its complexity, decides to show. The discrepancy between the data and reality was becoming unbearable. The first thing I did was return to the place where the body was found, an old house, one of those that in the neighborhood they call a family home, full of heavy furniture and paintings faded by time. From the outside, everything seemed normal, but I entered with the feeling that something didn't fit, that there were hidden details in the atmosphere which I couldn't grasp at first glance. The victim, a man of about 50 years, lay in a living room near a window that was slightly ajar. According to the initial report, his time of death was approximately 8:30 p.m., but the temperature inside the house, the rigidity of the body, and some other indicators didn't add up. I went over the scene again with the calm that experience imposes, inspecting every object, every detail. I noticed how the light came through that window and how the shadows stretched across the worn wooden floor. It wasn't just science guiding me, but an almost instinctive intuition that had saved me more than once, that sixth sense you develop after years of facing the irrational. On the dining table, some teacups still had steam rising slowly and faintly, which confirmed that not much time had passed since someone had been there. But that only complicated things. If someone had been there at that hour, what had changed the story? I leaned against the doorframe, trying to piece the puzzle together. The tissues of the body, upon analysis, suggested it died no less than 3 hours before the estimated time in the report, but the ambient temperature and cadaver rigidity spoke of something more recent. It was a clash of scientific indicators that forced me to dust off not only my forensic knowledge, but also my patience and perseverance. That same night, I went back to the lab with the body. In the cold, dry morgue, I performed a series of tests that I never thought we would review so thoroughly for a single case. I analyzed stomach contents, enzymatic activity, signs of decomposition, and, of course, the internal chemical conditions depending on the temperature and humidity I had precisely measured at the scene. The more I investigated, the more incredible it all became. The tests seemed to indicate that the estimated time was nothing more than an incomplete hypothesis based on metrics that, without context, were useless. That was when the situation took an unexpected turn. When talking with the family and neighbors, I discovered that the victim had an unstable routine. According to his sister, he usually had trouble falling asleep and could be heard walking around the house even during nighttime hours. This complicated the scenario. Could it be that the time of death didn't match because the victim had been moving after the interval in which he was supposedly deceased? Everything indicated that the initial timeline overlooked essential human factors, such as the very dynamics of that house, the rhythm of the person's life. The most striking moment came when I accessed the records of the digital clock in the house, which seemed to be working without problems and had been largely ignored. There, in the device's history, I found sudden movements recorded on the morning of the day after the estimated time of death. I shook my head, incredulous. That meant that someone, perhaps the victim himself, had activated the system without us having recorded anything like it. What if the time of death was miscalculated because the victim's demise occurred in stages? Or worse, that this information was part of setup, a confusion induced, perhaps unconsciously, by those who had provided us with the initial data? Time seemed to slip through my fingers as I gathered every piece of the puzzle. I spent sleepless hours reviewing all technical information and contrasting it with interviews that brought to light contradictory versions. Before me was a truth that didn't fit the usual parameters of forensic science. At that moment, the case ceased to be a simple procedure and became a personal challenge. I felt that the linearity of time had transformed into a labyrinth from which I could not escape. Everything, absolutely everything in that scene seemed to disguise the real story of what happened. The most disconcerting moment came when I managed to contact a neighbor, an older man who lived right next door, and who until then had remained silent. His account was key. He told me that on the night of the incident he heard unusual noises, sounds defying logic, muffled whispers, and soft footsteps upstairs. What seemed like a mystical testimony or a product of imagination gained real weight when this man coincided in many unsettling details with other neighbors, especially because this was a neighborhood where people have known each other forever and rarely lie. With each new piece of data, the official chronology collapsed. I began to wonder if science, in its eagerness to measure and quantify, was neglecting essential elements found in human experiences, intuitions, the chaos of emotions and decisions that are not detailed in a report. It was no coincidence that there were broken objects, crumpled papers, and a certain air of confrontation in the house that suggested a final tense argument or perhaps a desperate attempt to hide something. Nothing was clear, and that was precisely the most difficult point I had to face. Hours passed, and exhaustion suffocated me, but I couldn't stop. My mind kept turning over how a dead body could tell so many contradictory stories, and how a simple time, the supposed time of death, could become a true enigma. I tried to reconcile dates, tests, and testimonies, but each answer generated two new questions. This led me to revisit that open window, which at first seemed a minimal detail, and I still hadn't found a satisfactory explanation for its position the night the body was found. I returned to the scene before dawn, with natural light. I looked outside and noticed marks on the floor, that seemed like signs of quick movement toward the street. Among my thoughts came an idea I had previously discarded. What if the victim tried to escape or defend himself? What if the time of death was actually later than our machines indicated, but the body remained hidden from us for a while? What for science were fixed parameters of time and chemical reactions? For reality seemed a chaos of actions and grieving emotions. Ultimately, I decided to undertake a deeper analysis of the environment, a wider field analysis that didn't focus only on material evidence, but also involved human relationships and personal circumstances. The decision wasn't the devices or numbers, but in the story. I felt I had reached a limit that is not overcome with formulas, but with empathy and genuine curiosity. That's how I continued, night after night, with a firm conviction that to solve this mystery, I needed to understand the complexity of that day, accompanied by people who knew better the truth hidden beneath dust and silence. The body, the house, the clocks, and the words were only tools, but the definitive answer undoubtedly lay in the human story behind each piece of data. It taught me that science is fundamental, yes, but that time, both human and chronological, sometimes rebels against it and demands we investigate beyond the visible. That was the deepest lesson I learned, and today I want to share it with you. The truth is not always where we look first, and often it is necessary to go beyond the clock to find. I spent the following hours traversing an endless chain of questions and small revelations that seemed to pull me off course just when I thought I was making progress. The house itself became another character in this story, almost a trap of memory and time that enveloped me with its unsettling stillness. At one point, I decided to take a closer look at the marks I had seen near the window. Signs on the floor, slight scratches, and an irregular scattering of dust and small dry leaves. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, but there were no clear footprints leading toward the street, only confusing traces suggesting erratic movements in and out of that window. I began to wonder if more than one actor was involved, or if the victim had experienced their last moments in a state of mental confusion. I returned to the dining table, where the teacups remained untouched. Something as ordinary as that detail made me think about who had spent those hours with him. For a moment, I imagined that person sitting beside him, perhaps arguing or trying to calm an inner storm. The sister's words echoed more and more powerfully. That man, struggling to sleep, might have been facing more than just insomnia. He could have been fighting his own ghosts, problems that were not documented officially, but were palpable in the heavy atmosphere of the old house. I began to understand that, beyond the physical body, the corpse before me was also burdened with the tension of a saturated mind. 2 nights passed before I found a clue that forced me to leave the lab and return to the neighborhood with a different purpose. I had arranged a new interview and spoke to a neighbor who lived one street down, a woman who had so far avoided the matter with impenetrable silence. But this time her attitude changed. With a trembling voice and evasive gaze, she described an altercation she had heard and witnessed. Apparently, the night before the discovery, the victim had a heated argument with someone. I cannot say for sure whether inside or outside the house, but the essence of what she told me suggested that someone else was present that night, perhaps someone who could explain the inexplicable, the discrepancy between the scientific evidence and the actual timeline of events. This led me to consider the possibility that the first scene I investigated was not truly the last image of the tragedy. The body might have been moved, or the circumstances manipulated to cover other facts. The idea was not only unsettling, but also disturbingly logical. Suddenly, the house turned into a sort of theater where the truth was fragmented into scattered acts, not linearly connected, but rather thrown at random by an invisible author. It was as if the victim had been the protagonist of a confrontation, not only physical but temporal, a fight with time itself that now I had to unravel. I then returned to the morgue with a new hypothesis. If there had been post-mortem movement, I had to detect it. I looked again at the bloodshot tears recorded in the eyes, the condition of the muscles, any sign indicating a transfer or attempted interaction after the first chronological paradox. While examining microscopic details, I received a message from a forensic colleague, an old partner working in a nearby department. He posed a crucial question. Had I considered the influence of anomalous weather conditions that day? A technical detail, yes, but one that opened another angle of investigation. I consulted meteorological records and, to my surprise, found that the night of the discovery and the following morning were marked by very low humidity combined with sudden temperature fluctuations unusual for that time of year. In other words, the classic calculations about the time of death could not hold under such minimal humidity nor with such erratic thermal changes, because they significantly altered decomposition and other indicators we use as a compass in these cases. Suddenly, the mystery of the mismatched time was imprinted not only in the body's biology, but also in the ecosystem of the house and its surroundings. It was as if nature had deliberately intervened to cloud the truth. While studying this, I received an unexpected call. The victim's sister wanted to speak with me again, this time with more frankness and urgency. She confessed something she had always hidden, perhaps out of fear or shame, that there were unresolved conflict between her and her brother, wounds deeper than what was apparent, and that the night of the event she had spoken with him on the phone shortly before the approximate official time of death. But the most unsettling part was this. The voice she heard was not the same as always. It sounded altered, confused, as if losing control or struggling internally, perhaps against himself. This only added layers of complexity to the case, because not only the time was a mystery, but also the nature of the outcome. With this new information in mind, I focused on an aspect I had not explored in detail until then: the victim's mental health and personal situation in his final days. I reviewed medical records, testimonies from friends, and other statements pointing progressive deterioration, a fragile balance that could break in an instant. What seemed anecdotal became the missing link that explained the scientific inconsistencies, as if the mind had woven a parallel narrative to the physical signs, altering the perception of time both for him and those around him. Wandering aimlessly through the neighborhood searching for a sign, I received one last piece of information that at first seemed crazy but soon gained unforeseen relevance. A young neighbor, restless and somewhat melancholic, showed me a video taken from his window that very night, captured unintentionally, where a fragment of conversation could be heard interrupted by dull knocks and absolute silence. In the recording, there was also a brief light flicker inside the house, a flash that coincided with the approximate moment the digital clock movements I had reviewed days earlier had activated. This shattered all my certainties because it suggested a presence or event beyond the rational, forcing me to consider possibilities I had until then dismissed as a forensic doctor who trusted only verifiable facts. With my heart pounding, I returned to that house one last time, at least for now, opening every drawer, checking every corner where a shred of truth might hide. I found crumpled letters under a sofa, notes speaking of veiled threats, fear, and growing despair, but nothing clear to confirm. However, what impacted me most was a small wristwatch beside the corpse that did not seem to belong to the victim nor appeared in the initial inventories. That watch showed 11:15 p.m., a detail insignificant to a conventional forensic, but which for me became the pivot around which the entire investigation revolved. How to explain that this time, much later than the official one, matched the anomalies found in testimonies and technological records. At that moment, I understood that the timeline of this death could not be segmented or measured with usual precision. It had gone from being a univocal fact to a fragmented event in imprecise intervals, crossed by emotions, fears, lies, and contradictory movements. The victim, formerly just a number in a report, revealed himself as a being trapped in circumstances that transcend physical death, caught in a world of struggle against time and other factors I would never have suspected to encounter in my career. Fatigue and frustration nearly overcame me, but something kept pushing me forward. Beyond codes, numbers, and material signs, I became convinced that within the human complexity unfolding before me lay the key. It was not only about determining when he died, but understanding how and why that moment was drawn in diffuse and contradictory lines. Science can measure a heartbeat, body stiffness, even the chemistry signaling the end of life, but it cannot always capture the pulse of the emotions that unleashed that end, nor the desperate decisions or hidden tensions that precede it. That is why, as I walked once more through those hallways feeling the silent presence of one no longer there, I knew this case had changed me. The time that did not match was not a technical error nor a casual anomaly, but an invisible message that life and death sent me to remind me that the truth, no matter how much we want to freeze it in numbers, always escapes simple calculation. Reality consists of scattered fragments that only come together when we are willing to listen with empathy and humility, when we leave certain behind and accept uncertainty. This was my most mysterious case because, in the end, I realized I was not fighting only against measured time, but against human time, that which marks fatigue, fear, lies, and silence. And perhaps also against a small echo left after death, a time that refuses to coincide because it belongs to another world, to an intangible instant where life and death converse in secret, and only those of us willing to listen attentively might begin to understand. That last visit to the house was a moment of revelation, and also of dense silences, as if the very atmosphere had become charged with secrets fluctuating between the known and the hidden. I sat for a long while in the old dining chair, staring at that room that seemed to have stopped time, where on the table the teacups remained untouched and the dim light cast shadows that played at suggesting impossible shapes. At that moment, I understood that the house had a mind of its own, a memory woven from fragments of past voices, restless nights, and furtive movements. It was not simply the setting of an event, but a silent witness protecting more than it could ever reveal at first glance. With my mind still wrapped in these thoughts, I decided to examine again the wristwatch I had found next to the corpse. I couldn't help but notice the precision with which it marked that time, 11:15 p.m., an hour that seemed like a bright beacon amid that temporal confusion. The watch did not match the preliminary report nor the lab evidence, but it fit with details from the sister's account, the observations of the young neighbor, and the irregular temperature pattern that had brutally changed the way death had to be interpreted. What could that solitary, out-of-place watch mean? It wasn't a mere accessory, I told myself, but the key to opening a new door within this dark narrative structure. I put the notes back in order, trying to connect all those initially disconnected clues. The presence of possible witness who had until then remained silent, the homemade video that had by chance captured fragments of a tense conversation and disturbing sounds, and a letter found with words speaking of fear and threats. There were too many pieces suggesting another scenario, one in which the victim was not merely a biological outcome, but protagonist of a drama where psyche and environment conspired to prolong an agony beyond the visible. I now understood that the discrepant time reflected not only a biological moment, but an emotional turning point, a critical instant when everything began to collapse. Then, mentally reviewing the facts, an unexpected idea hit me hard. What if the victim, in their last moments, tried to manipulate time? Not literally, of course, but through their final acts, creating that temporal anomaly as a sort of last encrypted message. The way they had slipped that watch close to themselves, the strange pattern of movement inside and around the window, the distorted pulse recorded by the scientific team, all could be a form of resistance against an inexorable fate. I couldn't rule out that, in their mental confusion and anguish, they had tried to trick a narrative slipping away from them, unconsciously planting signs that later only someone attentive could follow. Soon, the rumor of this theory began to gain strength in me, pushing me to patiently and without prejudice re-listen to the pending testimonies. I called the sister again, this time with a different approach. I wanted her to tell me not only about the facts, but about the emotions, the small cracks and invisible fragments that mark a person's story before their end. She then confessed details she had not shared before. Stories of intimate torments, sleepless nights, crisis episodes where a brother got lost in his own world, with fuzzy and complicated contours. She also said that in those final phone conversations, the confused voice not only reflected fear, but a kind of plea, as if trying to ask for help without being understood. That revelation made me think that the real battle hadn't been against an aggressor or an accident, but against an internal shadow, a mental time suspended in anguish waiting. As I incorporated this new perspective, I realized that the house also held traces of it. On the walls, slight marks of blows and scratches could be seen that matched the neighbor's story and the scattered signs I had detected. Everything indicated that the victim lived those last moments wrapped in such an intense personal storm that it surpassed the physical and tangible. It was as if they had contracted into a space where reality fragmented, presenting several versions of their last minute, several overlapping hours of death in the same setting, as if the perception of time had dissolved in their final experience. At the same time, the traditional forensic analysis kept presenting its paradoxes. For example, rigor mortis showed an irregular pattern, partially developed, and in some muscles variables suggested a bodily environment affected by episodes of extreme agitation just before collapse. Bodily fluids and temperature simultaneously, provided contradictory data, as if the victim had been alive at different seasons of the biological clock. There was a gap that seemed impossible to reconcile, but now I could see from another angle. It was not an error, but a trace of their internal struggle against the inexorable arrival of death in the exact moment when everything vanished. That night, while reviewing the recordings and notes, I decided to once again compare the neighbor's video content with my own photographic archive of the house. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The light flash from the house, that short flicker which drew attention because of its synchrony with the abrupt noises, seemed to come precisely from the lamp near the window where the marks had been detected. The most logical interpretation might relate it to a momentary power outage, a technical failure. But immediately, I discarded such a mundane explanation because there was no evidence of power cuts that night. Rather, everything indicated that flicker was a kind of signal, a last hurrah from a house resisting letting go of a truth it had never clearly seen. In my mind echoed my colleague's words about climatic conditions and how alterations in humidity and temperature might have influenced not only the biological, but the emotional and energetic environment of that place. Could it be that the abrupt changes were a mirror of the internal storm the victims suffered? Nature acting as a mirror of the soul, and that, in this case, had synchronized with the tragedy to inscribe a message impossible to decode without the help of empathy and patience. It seemed to me that all these elements were the perfect metaphor for the distorted time that had defined that tragedy. Fatigue was already draining my strength, and I felt more than ever trapped between science and the invisible, between technical certainty and human conjecture. However, my conviction grew intensely. That story could not be solved only with formulas or material evidence. It required, instead, entering that intangible fabric of silences, unspoken words, barely hinted facts. That is why, on one last round to the house, I took the wristwatch and sat by the window where it all seemed to have begun. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine what that person had lived through, their frantic steps, scattered mind, trembling hands. In my head mixed the tick-tock of the watch and my own heartbeat, seeking synchrony. Suddenly, I felt a certainty that seemed like it came from a dream. The time that didn't match was not an error, nor malicious manipulation nor accident. It was the purest manifestation of the human condition, of what happens when inner and outer time lose their common rhythm. Life and death converse in a space where the rules of chronology became blurry, where emotions dictated the pace, and where the truth fragmented like a broken mirror. I understood that this temporal discrepancy was, after all, a painful and beautiful metaphor, a last resistance to the impossibility of accepting the end, a way in which the soul fought to keep its existence alive even though the body no longer responded. That early morning I left the house with a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. As I walked to the car, I thought about the fragility of memory, about time's power to confuse us and organize our reality at the same time. And in that thought, I felt I had learned something essential. Science without humanity is an incomplete path, and truth without emotional understanding is a mutilated story. My role, beyond technical expertise, was to accept that mixture and walk with it. Because the time that didn't match not only taught me that death does not always refer to a precise moment, but is also a story woven from uncertainties and silences, sometimes as tangible as any marker in a medical report. As I write this, I can still feel the intangible presence of that person, of that lost moment, and the constellation of emotions that surrounded it. I don't know if one day I'll be able to offer a definitive answer, but I do know that this case is an invitation to look at death with more human eyes, to listen to the story hidden between the numbers, and to understand that sometimes truth is something that resists being measured with conventional clocks. Because behind every hour, every mark, and every sign beats a story that can only be revealed when we have the courage and the patience to look beyond the time we think we control. That is how I learned that in the silence of death, in the contradiction of times that never coincide, there lies a truth much deeper and more mysterious. A time that is not measured in seconds or minutes, but with the intensity of the life that was, and with the echo that, perhaps, will never cease to resonate. And that echo is the one that stays with us when we turn off the lights and close the pages of a case that, in the end, inaugurated in me a new way of understanding not just death, but time itself. IT didn't take long before an unexpected new piece of the puzzle tore apart the fabric I thought I had carefully woven. That very week, an anonymous call led me to a small trash bin located in an alley near the house. There, among scraps of garbage and crumpled paper, I found a worn leather notebook, abundant in pages filled with tight and bold handwriting. It was not a common diary. It seemed more like a notebook of notes, thoughts broken into bursts, confusing and sharp, as if reflecting the restless mind of the victim who desperately tried to organize their inner world in the face of that clock which, unintentionally, had become their symbol. I spent long hours reading those fragments, rereading every word in search of answers, until I realized that this was not a typical testimony, but a map of a tormented soul, a deep cartography of fears, hopes, and a constant struggle against time slipping mercilessly through their fingers. The most striking discovery was that it not only spoke of the fear of death, but also of an anxiety translated into a strange ritual related to the clock itself. They referred to it as my guardian of time, a metaphor that had been in the air long before that fateful day. Its owner seemed to believe that in that object resided a way to control the flow of their existence, as if they themselves could stop or delay the march of the seconds, a desperate attempt to reconcile with a destiny that felt increasingly near and unavoidable. There were detailed descriptions of repetitive movements, adjusting clock, synchronizing it with daylight, staring obsessively at the advancing second hand as if their survival depended on that detail. This obsession was an attempt to anchor their consciousness to a known time, despite that clock seeming, precisely, strongly disconnected from the real time marked by facts and science. Those notes open a door to the psychology of the victim, an intense look inside the psyche of someone caught between a desire to maintain control and an inevitable feeling of losing everything. In several paragraphs, interspersed with designs and enigmatic symbols, there were references to inner voices, to a sense of an alien presence, to shadows that could not be dispelled by light or reason. This almost mystical dimension of the experience, far from mere hallucinations, was perhaps what distorted their perception of time in the final moments, altering not only their actions but also how the body responded to trauma. This validated on a new and disturbing level the discord I perceived in the biological signs, placing the body and mind in a battlefield where neither medicine nor logic could triumph. But the story did not end there. Recalling a suspicion that had lingered from the beginning, I revisited the home video in a new nighttime session. This time, I paid attention beyond the noises and voices, focusing on the smallest details that had previously been only noise. Then I noticed something extraordinary. At a very specific, barely perceptible moment, the shadow reflected in the window made sinuous movements, almost too human to be a simple shadow. Its movement seemed conscious, as if trying to communicate or warn. A flicker in the footage made me advance frame by frame, until, in a fragment of less than a second, the shadow formed a shape that could be interpreted as an outstretched hand, making a gesture. That striking image shattered the cold logic of scientific examination and placed me in murky terrain where reality and perception confusedly blended. It was a visual testimony of a phenomenon that seemed to defy known laws, a symbolic manifestation of the temporal disconnection that the house seemed to encapsulate. At the same time, I decided to speak again with the neighbor who had recorded the video. His account, initially even more confusing, made sense when he confessed that he felt a strange presence that night, a tension in the air that broke through routine. He told me that even the electricity in his house had flickered slightly without explanation, something uncommon in that very quiet neighborhood. Additionally, he added that, above all, he had heard a very strong heartbeat, almost like a vibrant pulse that couldn't be associated with any machinery, but with a life that seemed to resist disappearing. That confusion, that palpable yet intangible sensation, not only matched the anomalies of the case, but gave it a human dimension that helped to understand the strange relationship between objective and subjective time within that tragedy. As I gathered more details, the figure of the victim became more human beyond the corpse. That person, with all their fragility and inner storm, seemed less like a mere object of study and more like a being struggling against invisible forces, using every available resource, from the physical to symbolic, to leave a mark. That reflection let me mark a crucial difference. Death was not a cold and singular event, but a process filled with moments, a series of overlapping, confusing, and resisting episodes. The clock stopped at 11:15 p.m., then was not just a temporal marker, but a kind of emotional code, a sign laden with meaning that transcended the clinical. The next night, I walked to the house again, this time intending to understand the space, not only as a setting, but as a living, active entity committed to guarding and hiding secrets. I walked slowly through each room, stopping at those cracks that seemed to whisper forgotten stories in the gloom. In the victim's room, the air felt denser, and for a moment I felt, with a racing heart, as if that environment held a suspended energy, a resistance to letting go of that final fragment of existence. I placed the clock on the table, letting its ticking resonate softly and melodiously, trying to synchronize it with my breathing and with the distant pulse I could still feel as a vibration in the walls. Then, in that absolute silence, something changed. A gust of air swept through the room, clear enough to slightly move the curtains, but without opening any doors. It was as if the house itself breathed with me, synchronized its pulsations with mine, or at least with the beat that object represented. I realized the house, this space charged with history, was also inhabited by that invisible struggle between life and death, between measured time and the sense of inner time. There I understood that I was not only facing a regular crime scene, but a phenomenon that challenged the way we usually understand the end, a profound manifestation of what happens when the body fades, but the mind and soul still insist on resisting, creating, marking territory. Days passed, and my investigation took a more introspective, more philosophical turn. I could no longer cling only to conclusive evidence or incontrovertible data. I needed, instead, to accept that my role was also to listen to that murmur of life that remained after death, to understand those temporal fractures as echoes of an experience too complex to be justified by formulas. In that process, I recalled a phrase a mentor told me many years ago. Death is not an end, but a transition where yesterday, today, and tomorrow coexist. And that idea resonated powerfully in the face of the evidence in this case, because truly there in that house and that misplaced clock, several times, several simultaneous nows coexisted. One of the most disconcerting moments came when I consulted a specialist in chronobiology who explained how certain chemical and physiological reactions in the body can be affected by episodes of extreme stress or deep personal trauma, altering normal patterns of death. That resonated with what I had detected in the analyses, but also opened an extraordinary question. Those changes could be influenced not only by physical factors, but also by the psychic and emotional dimension of the person, a terrain still little explored by science, but infinitely real in human experience. In that encounter, I understood that the body and mind not only communicate, but sometimes collaborate in distorting objective data to convey messages that escape usual logic. This idea not only led me to reconsider the evidence, but to accept a new forensic epistemology where subjectivity is as important as objectivity. Returning to my notes, I found, almost at the end of the notebook, a phrase that seemed to illuminate everything. The time I have left is not the one on the clock, but the one I can live in my mind. A thought unforgettable today, which made me understand the poetic, albeit tragic, nature of this story. That clock, with its strange time, was not a mistake nor an unsolvable mystery, but a painful metaphor of the struggle between the external and internal clock, between the measure of the world and the experience of the self. In that last battle, the victim left a message for those who would understand. Truth is not always found in precision. Sometimes it lies in delirium, in waiting, in the incomplete fragment of a moment that refuses to die. Looking back, I have come to think that this was perhaps my most mysterious case, not because it defied science, but because it revealed the human complexity science tries to understand. It was not a failure of the method nor a supernatural mystery. It was a mirror in which I saw reflected the vulnerability of us all in the face of that concept as intangible as essential, time. An invitation to see death not as a fixed point, but as a fabric of possibilities, a coded language written with biological signs and intertwined emotions, a map without all routes clear but full of meaning. Now, every time I see a clock, I think of that fateful 11:15 p.m., the hour that did not match, that didn't fit in any calendar or report, but which beat with immense force at the heart of the story that taught me the deepest truth lies in intimate listening, in the openness to acknowledge that science cannot always tame time, and that sometimes only in silence and acceptance is the light found. That case changed me, made me a doctor and also a narrator, a scientist, and also a sensitive witness. And although the questions remain there, floating in an atmosphere that never quite clears, What I know for certain is that that hour that never matched became for me the symbol of eternity, contained a moment, the indelible mark of the human struggle against time, and the silent promise that in every ending there is always a trace, an echo, a story waiting to be told. Weeks passed, and the case began to grow even murkier, as if every piece of information only gave rise to new questions that folded back on themselves in an infinite labyrinth. In my mind, that hour that didn't match had become more than a technical detail. It was a powerful symbol and a lingering suspicion that the victim, in some way, had crossed beyond conventional time. But what did that really mean? Was it possible that the altered perception of time this person had in the face of death had left a tangible mark in the physical world? I refused to dismiss it. I remember one particularly intense night. I was reviewing the tissue sample analyses yet again, trying to find some rational explanation for the chemical alterations that contradicted the official time of death. I had armed myself with graphs, tables, and formulas that could turn any mystery into numbers, but that night logic seemed unable to grasp anything solid. As the clock in my office softly marked the minutes, a strange sensation took hold of me, as if somehow the very environment conspired to show me something that was right there, waiting to be seen. It was then that the pieces began to fit together in an unusual and disconcerting way. Going over the home video repeatedly, I tried to focus on small details that might have escaped my notice in previous moments. The shadow that drew almost human shapes, those curves and lines that seemed like the extension of a non-physical will, had put me on the trail of something greater. Then I noticed something almost imperceptible, a gesture of the shadow that seemed to point not only toward the window, but at a specific object within the room, right beside the clock. It was as if that invisible presence was trying to tell me something, a message encoded without words. I didn't feel fear, but rather a deep curiosity, an invitation to look beyond the obvious. I returned to the house at dawn, with the dim light of a flashlight as my only companion, and stood exactly where the shadow seemed to want to guide me. Upon careful inspection, I came across a small metal box hidden beneath the carpet, nearly imperceptible. I extracted it slowly, with a mixture of anticipation and respect, and inside found a series of old photographs and letters, almost all handwritten by the victim, although addressed to recipients I couldn't immediately identify. Each letter was a confession, a fragmented account of their life and obsessions, but what stood out most was one describing an experience of temporal unfolding, a moment when they felt their consciousness had completely detached from normal time and inhabited a space where past, present, and future coexisted simultaneously. Thus, the investigation took an unexpected turn, revealing a terrain increasingly less scientific and increasingly more human, almost spiritual. I realized there was in those letters an invitation to understand that struggle against time not as an external phenomenon, but as an internal process, a personal battle the victim had tried to unravel and face until their last heartbeat. That feeling found me looking again at the clock, no longer as a simple measuring device, but as a reliquary full of meaning, a symbol of resistance against the relentless and irreversible. With the discovery of the letters came a series of deeper interviews with those who had known the victim. Each account added new pieces to an emotional puzzle. A man marked by intense fear of loss, of silent disappearance, of time slipping away like water through fingers. For his close friends, that obsession with the clock was not simply a whim, but a defense mechanism that fed a secret hope. Beyond the scientist seeking concrete answers, I began to feel the human being who had suffered, who had tried to impose order on his existential chaos with that peculiar ritual. However, that movement toward empathy and emotional understanding also brought with it an escalation of personal tension. I noticed that the deeper I delved into the victim's disturbed psyche, the closer an intangible presence felt around me. I couldn't help feeling that the boundary between tangible reality and subjective perception blurred in that house, in that investigation, as if the story itself was relentlessly entrapping me. At night, returning home, the ticking of the clock I had brought with me seemed to resonate with an intensity that sometimes unsettled me, as if every second reminded me I was facing something more complex than a simple forensic case. As hours and days went by, another unexpected twist emerged. I began to notice irregularities in the house's electrical and electronic records. Devices failing without apparent cause, lights flickering on and off randomly, equipment showing sporadic malfunctions precisely within the time frame recorded as the time of death. It was as if the space itself was reacting, as if the victim's emotional vibration still permeated the wall's object's atmosphere. This defied any rational explanation, but at the same time made sense of what I had seen on the video. The almost human shadows that could not be dismissed by mere scientific rigor. In a genuine attempt to find a connection point among all these manifestations, I decided to work closely with psychologists specialized in trauma phenomena and altered perception. His perspective opened a different horizon for me. The idea that near moments of death, the human mind can generate alternative realities, heightened perceptions where past and present intermingle, and where time itself may lose its usual linearity. According to him, this was not supernatural but a psychic function that seeks to cling to life, creating a temporal refuge where the subject can attempt to negotiate, accept, or delay the imminent end. This revelation brought a deep personal reflection. I understood that the body, when desynchronized in its biological functions, also responded to mind struggling to sustain itself, seeking mechanisms to prolong a time it felt was too short to resolve unfinished business, to capture moments the clock was unwilling to lend. Medical science, until then relentlessly exact, had included an intangible but essential variable in its calculations, emotion and subjectivity, which can give the body a new dimension, a fragmented and complex time that challenges traditional views. But it didn't end there. Driven by intuition and supported by the multidisciplinary team, I proposed a hypothesis that broke with everything known. What if that temporal disconnection was not only an individual condition, but a property of the place itself, a kind of time which that trapped fragments of existence? With that idea in mind, we studied the site again, especially at the magic hour of 11:15 p.m., which was eventually dubbed the hour that didn't match. We installed high-precision sensors, audio and video recorders running continuously, hoping to capture phenomena that could explain the recorded anomalies. What we recorded was baffling. In the shadowed moments of that particular hour, the equipment detected energy fluctuations, subtle changes in ambient temperature, and, above all, an acoustic resonance that seemed to vibrate at a frequency very close to human heartbeat. It was neither an echo nor common background noise, but repeated pulse, a kind of signal, like the persistent memory of a moment refusing to disappear. Witnessing that vibration led me to wonder to what extent death can be, precisely, a resonance, a way life prolongs itself, not in the body but in spaces and times beyond our comprehension. Despite all this, I never lost sight that behind these strange phenomena was a human being whose story truly mattered. The clock, biological signs, shadows, and vibration were only the visible envelope of a deeper internal struggle that sometimes translated into tangible symptoms. My investigation became an attempt to narrate, with rigor but also respect, the complexity of that process. Because I understood that in every case, in every death, there remains a story, a time that resists adequate measurement because it is full of meaning, emotions, and subjectivities that traditional science cannot and should not ignore. Thus, the case that began with a discrepancy of times and signs began to transform into a narrative about the very nature of time and human experience. The victim did not just die at 11:15 p.m. as indicated by the clock, but also at that final instant that extended beyond measurement, in that inner fragment where consciousness wrestled with its own eternity. In that sense, the hour that didn't match became a symbol for me, a reminder that there are aspects of being and dying that cannot fit into numbers or reports, that belong to the realm of experience and memory, and deserve to be heard with humility and openness. When closing the file, the feeling I was left with was that the case had not been a failure nor an unresolved enigma, but rather an opening to a new kind of investigation, an invitation to reconsider the boundary between science and experience. Every sign, every shadow, and every note found were not scattered elements, but parts of the same story written in parallel spaces and times that I tried to decipher through reason, sensitivity, and intuition. I understood that death, more than a punctual event, is a complex phenomenon where multiple dimensions converge, and that therein, in that confluence, lies the deepest and most human truth I can reach as a physician. Now, whenever I think of that impossible hour, 11:15 p.m., I feel it is not a mistake nor an anomaly, but an invitation to keep exploring, to remember that time is much more than a clock, and that death is not a straight line, but a space of encounters, paradoxes, and invisible prolongations. That case restored my faith in the complexity of the human being and the certainty that science, although powerful, will always need empathy and listening to reach a complete truth. Because, after all, the hours that seem not to match teach us that, deep down, time is a mystery revealed only when we learn to observe with an open heart, right where everything, even death, has an unexpected and profound meaning. That night, while the records once again showed those inexplicable fluctuations, I felt that something was about to change. It wasn't just the accumulation of data or the curious observations that kept me awake, but the increasingly strong certainty that I was part of something beyond my usual understanding. I found myself in the middle of a threshold, an invisible border separating the tangible from the intangible, the scientific from the mystical, the recorded from the lived. I had arrived at that point after weeks of meticulous exploration, but also after stopping at a detail that at first seemed insignificant. The silence preceding 11:15 p.m., a strange calm in which even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I remember that at that very moment, while reviewing the audio recordings, a slight whisper began to emerge from the background noise. It was so faint that anyone could have overlooked it, but my attention was finely tuned. That vibration, that resonance similar to a steady heartbeat, transformed into a kind of deep and firm beat that seemed to run through my veins. It was no ordinary sound. It seemed to carry the intention to communicate something beyond words, something that transcended any language. I remained motionless, as if time itself had stopped around that pulse that slowly grew, rocking the shadows of the room and casting a faint halo over the stopped clock. At that moment, I understood that the phenomenon was not just a resonance of death, but a vital echo, a persistent fragment of consciousness that resists completely extinguishing. I thought of the letters I had found, of those confessions where the victim recounted their experience of temporal unfolding, as if their mind had created a capsule in which they supervised, without haste or fear, the passage between life and the unknown. It was not just a psychiatric account or an attempt to rationalize fear. It was a release so vivid that it had left traces, tangible marks, in the environment itself. The shadows in the video, the fluctuations in the current, the cryptic messages in the darkness all made sense then, as pieces not of physical puzzle, but a story of resistance and memory. Waking up the next day, I felt my own limits beginning to blur. The boundary between the investigator and the object of study was becoming increasingly faint, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was also becoming part of that timeless vibration, another link in the invisible chain that connects past, present, and future. It was in that especially delicate reflection that I decided to delve even deeper into combining scientific analysis with open dialogue with the emotions and human narratives linked to this mystery. Each conversation with those close to the case or with experts in trauma psychology added new nuances. Stories of losses not only physical but temporal, of moments when a mind desperately clung to the hours that seemed to vanish. As the exploration progressed, a growing sense that time behaved differently in that house became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a matter of superstitions or supernatural phenomena, but something much more subtle and complex. A space charged with emotional energy that permeated the object's altered electrical functions and resonated through the very waves of the environment. The place itself seemed to want to tell a story through those interruptions, winking at those patient enough to listen to those whispers. I then decided to spend entire nights in the house, not only to record data, but to observe with awakened senses, try to capture that hidden dimension that machines cannot always reach. One early morning, while the clock marked the impossible hour, I felt a nearby presence, like a soft breath crossing the room. It wasn't fear. It was rather a strange form of companionship. In that moment of silence broken only by a gentle tick-tock, I experienced an unexpected clarity. I understood that the struggle against time was not a whim or a mental illness, but universal trial, the way humans negotiate with finitude. The hour that didn't match ceased to be an error or anomaly and became a symbol of hope that even in death, life can persist on levels science has yet to measure. It was a revelation that shook me to the core of my training and prejudices. As that thought settled within me, I kept feeling that this case, far from concluding, was opening like a door to new perspectives. I thought about how that space, charged with echoes and memories, demonstrated that time is not an immutable line, but a malleable fabric, affected by emotional weight, memory, and consciousness. Suddenly, I understood that every human being carries within a secret temporal dimension, unfolding and contracting, stretching and fragmenting according to what they feel, fear, or long for. This story, scaling from a simple time discrepancy to a meditation on the human experience, brought me back to my place, not only as a forensic doctor, but also as a storyteller and guardian of those indelible hours. I cannot deny that this case changed me deeply. It taught me that the frantic search for exactness does not always capture the human complexity behind a death event. Every biological sign, every stopped clock or shadow in a video is a fragment of a broader reality, where science must coexist with emotion, intuition, and empathy. In that sense, death ceased to be a cold end, a fact to be recorded, to become instead a lived phenomenon with layers that intertwine and resist simplification. And if there is one thing I take from this experience, it is a conviction that scientific research, however rigorous, only finds its true meaning when it does not forget that behind every number there is a life, a story, and above all, a time that can only be understood if observed with an open heart. Never before had I understood that phrase so deeply. The hour that didn't match. Now I know it is not a technical anomaly nor a calculation error, but a challenge life presents to invite us to look beyond the clock. It is a sign to remember that our limits are often the limits of our understanding, and that there exists an invisible time, a time that beats deep within, a time where past, present, and future embrace and generate, amid darkness, a faint but steady light. At the end of this report, the image I hope to leave behind is that death, in its enigma, is not a wall that halts the vital flow, but a threshold where the human experience multiplies and expands into unknown territories. That story taught me that science and humanity are not opposites, but allies who, together, can discover new ways to understand the mystery of time and existence. Because, ultimately, the true hour that doesn't match is the one offered only to those brave enough to accept that time is much more than a clock, and that death is not an end, but an infinite beginning.